Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome back, everyone. We're very, very excited today to have with us Prabhat Patnaik, who is Professor Emeritus at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's written more than 10 books, including most recently Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present with Utsa Patnaik. That was published in 2021 with Monthly Review Press, and A Theory of Imperialism, also with Utsa Patnaik in 2016. That was published with Columbia University Press. He specializes in macroeconomics and political economy, but he's also a regular contributor to contemporary political debates. He served as the vice chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board from June 2006 to May 2001. And he was part of a 4-member task force for the United Nations to recommend reform measures for the global financial system. I think most people on the call are already familiar with his work. We're very excited to have him here today. And per usual, we'll start out with a kind of series of questions that I've shared in advance with Professor Patnaik, and then we'll open up for a more general conversation. So first and foremost, we're here to discuss your important work on the analysis of capitalism, fascism, and the struggle for socialism. Could you begin by giving us a brief overview of your intellectual trajectory, explaining why these issues have come to be so central in your scholarship, which schools of thought and political movements have informed you, and how would you situate your work in relationship to them?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this session. I'm really grateful. I was born in 1945, which means that roughly my childhood coincided with the birth of the free Indian nation, because freedom came in 1947, and therefore I saw the country, a sort of free, independent India being born. And the excitement of that, the camaraderie of that period, and the democracy that generally prevailed, the kind of empowerment of the people that one witnessed, is something that really left a very deep imprint on my mind, which is not to say that the cleavages of Indian society, the caste system, the untouchability, and so on, disappeared. But there was a certain hope that all of it were really things of the past. And the India that we were now going to witness was going to be rid of all these, not of course immediately, but certainly over a period of time. So there was an enormous sense of optimism. And along with it was a sense of left conviction. You see, those days, almost everybody was left, because you're one kind of left or the other. You're either a Nehruvian left, or you're a communist left, or you're a socialist left, or you're a Gandhian left. And, almost everybody, precisely because it was an anti-colonial struggle against, capitalist imperialism, almost everybody was quite left-oriented. And there was an enormous amount of sympathy for the Soviet Union, not just because of the fact that the Soviet Union had been involved in defeating Hitler, but also because the Soviet Union had been a steadfast supporter of India's independence. And after independence, the kind of statist strategy, relatively autonomous of US imperialism, which India followed, or which was part of its non-alignment foreign policy stance, is something which could not have been possible without the Soviet Union. For instance, in oil exploration, when the Seven Sisters, as the 7 major oil companies of that time were called, when the Seven Sisters refused to process cheaper Soviet crude in India, and instead they did transfer pricing by importing crude controlled by them from the Middle East. They control the raw sources, and they charged exorbitant prices, which they passed on to the Indian consumers. But the Soviet Union was willing to offer crude at much cheaper prices, but on the other hand, they refused to process them, refine them. Because of which then the Soviet Union helped India to set up its own refinery capacity, likewise in steel. Anyway, so as I was saying, so that is something. My father was a freedom fighter who was in jail for many years, and he went from being a follower of Gandhi to being a socialist, a Congress socialist, and then he was one of the early communists in the country. So in that sense, I was brought up in extremely impecunious circumstances, but on the other hand, with an extremely politically alive environment. Of course, I did not really understand anything about Marxism and so on at that time, just a certain sympathy for the left. Later, when I was doing my master's and so on, I went to Oxford. I got a Rhodes Scholarship. I went to Oxford. I was in Balliol and Nuffield, and that coincided with the period of student uprising. Some brilliant, mostly of who subsequently well know. Althusser was a very big name at that point, and we really discussed Althusser ad nauseum, and so on. The thing which impressed me about Marxism was not just, I mean, I was not just the fact that it provided an explanation for a number of things, but I see Marxism not just as normally people see it, namely as advancing the productive, socialism as advancing the productive forces which come into some kind of a under capitalism, but actually a project. I don't see it as a production project, but as a freedom project. And I believe is incompatible with freedom, because that it is some others and also cannot be free, impossible to overcome the extreme poverty that we see in the world, extreme material poverty we see in the world under capitalist conditions. And of course, capitalism, as Marx had said, is really a system of universal alienation, where people act not because of their own volition, but they act because they are more or less coerced into acting through competition in specific ways. The workers are coerced into acting in specific ways. The capitalists are coerced into acting in specific ways. And therefore, individual freedom is really incompatible. Individual freedom is incompatible with capitalism. For all these reasons, I really then moved in a conscious manner to the left, where I currently am.
Great, wonderful. Just so that you know, the audio went out a little bit. I don't know if it's possible to either sit closer to the modem or use an Ethernet connection. It was fine towards the end of your response, so we're going to keep going with it. The next question that I have is about your important work on neoliberalism. And I wanted to see if you could explain why it is for you that it is nothing short of the impasse of the capitalist system. So unlike some other theorists of neoliberalism who insist on its adaptability to new situations, its ability to constantly recuperate any form of resistance, you insist that neoliberalism has brought capitalism to a crossroads. You write in Capital and Imperialism, this is on page 302, quote, "The system cannot move forward without overcoming the hegemony of international finance capital. But at the same time, this hegemony cannot be overcome without unleashing a process of transcendence of capitalism itself." Why and how, then, is this the case?
one of the main conclusions, Keynesian revolution in economics, which occurred in the 1930s, and which I would rather like to call the Kaleskian Keynesian revolution, because whatever Keynes was talking about was independently arrived at by the Polish Marxist economist Mikhail Kalecki. So I would really call it the Kaleskian Keynesian revolution of the 1930s. One of its real main findings was that capitalism is a demand constrained system, that it's a system in which employment and output and so on are generally where they are because the demand, aggregate demand, is where it is. If you have an increase in aggregate demand, in that case, in capitalist conditions, you can have a rise in level of output and employment. This is so not just in a crisis. Of course, in a crisis, this is the case, but this is so even in the normal functioning of the system, that capitalism classically is a demand constrained system. Therefore, if we are, and particularly so, of course, in a crisis, because in a crisis, there is essentially a reduction in the level of aggregate demand. Now, if so, in that case, overcoming the crisis requires an injection of aggregate demand into the system. Now, this injection cannot occur through consumption because consumption is generally determined by the levels of income people get. The rich people get a lot more of income than they consume. The poor people generally consume whatever income they have. But consumption is something which is not really an independent source of aggregate demand. Investment depends upon the expected growth of the market. If the market is not supposed to grow, no capitalist is going to invest just because aggregate demand is low. And therefore, the injection of aggregate demand is something that typically, according to Keynes, so supposed to occur through government expenditure. Rosa Luxemburg had actually argued much, much earlier that this injection of demand occurs through sales to the pre-capitalist markets. But of course, the pre-capitalist markets now are not large enough, they're exhausted and so on, and they cannot really provide the kind of stimulus that they would have done in the pre-First World War period. And therefore, in contemporary situations, it is state injection of demand through larger state expenditure, which is really required. Now, of course, the state would have to inject, would have to finance this larger expenditure either by not taxing anybody, in which case you spend $100, but you're not taxing anybody, so nobody's demand goes down. Or alternatively, you spend $100, but you tax the rich, in which case, if you raise 100 from them, their consumption may go down by 30, 40, or whatever. There's a net increase in aggregate demand. But if the state spends by taxing the working people who more or less consume their entire incomes, in that case, the net injection of demand is very little. And therefore, state expenditure is something which can be a source of demand, as Keynes argued, Kalecki argued, and so on, only if it is financed either through a fiscal deficit or it is financed by taxing the rich, who in fact do not consume their entire income. Therefore, when a part of it is taxed, then the amount that their demand goes down by is much smaller than what is taxed away. But both these ways of increasing state expenditure are really anathema as far as finance capital is concerned. Finance capital obviously does not like that there be a taxation of the rich. In fact, very recently we had an example when the Biden administration wanted to have an internationally agreed corporate tax rate of 25%, but on the other hand, this was something which was shot down. The internationally agreed corporate tax rate was fixed at 15%, which is lower than the corporate tax rates that prevail in most of the countries anyway. So that, the finance capital, and this is not just today, finance capital has always been, of course, opposed to taxation of the rich, and it's also been opposed to a fiscal deficit, which means not taxing anybody and the government just spending by borrowing from the central bank or whatever. Now, this is something which was apparent, for instance, in 1929, when Britain had the beginnings of the Great Depression. In Britain, it began even before 1931. It began in 1929, when the level of unemployment was about half of what it was during the depth of the Great Depression. Lloyd George, who was the Liberal leader, on the suggestion of Keynes, made a proposal that actually some employment should be provided through public works, which were financed by a fiscal deficit. That it's not going to pinch anybody. As a result, it is a situation where people would become better off, with nobody becoming worse off. But on the other hand, it was shot down by the British Treasury under the pressure from the City of London, which is where British finance capital is located. So finance capital is always opposed to a fiscal deficit, obviously opposed to a taxation of the rich. But now what you have is finance capital is globalized, while the government that might be spending more belongs to a nation state. Therefore, if you have globalized finance with a nation state, then the global nation state has more or less got to kowtow to the whims and caprices of globalized capital, which is why I believe it is impossible for any individual nation state, government of any individual nation state, to do the kind of increase in expenditure which is required to pull capitalism out of its current situation of stagnation. And that is why I believe capitalism is in a very serious crisis. Now, there is one possibility. By serious, I mean protracted crisis. One possibility was during the Great Depression, namely that you have a coordinated fiscal stimulus, that you don't have a fiscal stimulus which is given by a single state, a single government, but is something which is given by a whole lot of governments coming together. In which case, of course, if you have a coordinated fiscal stimulus today, then globalized finance cannot really go from one country to another, because all countries are together more or less pursuing this coordinated stimulus. And therefore, it is as if you have a globalized finance, then you have a surrogate global state, a surrogate world state in economic policy making, which is what a coordinated fiscal stimulus would amount to. But this is a point which has not been mooted at all. And what is more, it is something which, if mooted, would remain confined only to some advanced countries, from which the poorer countries would be left out, and therefore that would actually worsen the hiatus in the world economy. So whichever way one looks at it, capitalism, it seems to me, has reached a kind of dead end, which I have been talking about in my writings.
Wonderful. I am kind of curious how the US case would fit within this, given the deficit that they've run, and also the work of people like Michael Hudson and others that have focused on the kind of historical arc of the US deficit. But I'll flag that as something that you're welcome to respond to or might come up later in the Q&A, just in the interest of getting on to the next question that I already shared with you that does overlap to some extent. I'm curious to hear you on how you understand one of the arguments that you make historically is that capitalism has relied on a kind of exogenous stimulus of sorts, and that the colonial arrangement did play a crucial role as an exogenous stimulus, but that was exhausted more or less by the time of World War I, while state intervention in demand management, you say, which acted as the main exogenous stimulus after the Second World War, cannot serve the purpose any longer because of the opposition of globalized finance capital, as you were just saying. And so the only way that neoliberal capitalism has to kind of rejuvenate itself is through a mechanism that is based on asset price bubbles, right? I'm interested, in light of this thesis, what do you make of the accounts of neoliberalism that emphasize the dismantling of the social welfare state as a form of stimulus for capitalist accumulation and its rampant privatizations, which have often gone into, or did go into overdrive in the wake of this dismantling of the Soviet Union and Soviet-style socialism more generally? Or for that matter, what do you make of the role of the kind of recolonization or neoliberal subordination of the former socialist countries, whose brutal shock therapy has sometimes been described as a stimulus for capitalist growth? Finally, another example that comes to mind is, what do you make of the aggressive militarism as a site of so-called primitive accumulation with all of the US-led wars? Are any of these examples of exogenous or endogenous stimulus for capitalist growth in the neoliberal era? How do you understand them in relationship to the fundamental thesis that you just outlined?
You know, dismantling of welfare state expenditure, dismantling of the welfare state, privatizing of the welfare state is something which, if anything, acts as a negative stimulus, because the government was spending something. Now it is handed over to the private sector. The private sector then decides whether to increase or not to increase. The prices go up. As the prices go up, effectively, that's a transfer of purchasing power from ordinary people to the capitalists who happen to now own these privatized health and education services and so on. So that I think many of these are really, instead of adding to the level of aggregate demand, would necessarily subtract from it. For instance, I know that in India, the government is giving huge amounts of tax subsidies to the capitalists in the hope that they would thereby be induced to make larger investments. Now, the point is that since there is a fiscal responsibility legislation where there is a limit on the fiscal deficit, when the government gives tax subsidies to the capitalists, it has to make up for that expenditure by taxing the non-capitalists, which means the ordinary people. And therefore, effectively a purge from the working people to the capitalists. Now, if there is such a transfer, since the working people consume more of their income than the capitalists do, and the capitalists don't add an iota to investment unless there is an expectation of a growth in markets. Just because you have more money does not necessarily mean that you make more investments, because of which, in fact, the net effect of such transfers is a reduction in the level of aggregate demand. Now, many of the cases which you just now recounted are cases where really there is no addition to aggregate demand that is involved. You know, these are very important aspects of contemporary capitalism, but on the other hand, they are not necessarily aspects that would get capitalism out of the crisis. And here I'd just like to take one moment to talk about the question which you raised earlier about the United States. Many people believe that the US could act as a surrogate world state. I mean, as far as capitalism is concerned, the biggest power and so on, it could act as a surrogate world state. And if the US, whose currency is considered to be almost as good as gold, decides to have a larger fiscal deficit, then finance is not going to quit the US in any large measure. That okay, if France decides to go to have a larger fiscal deficit and therefore to stimulate activity, it won't be allowed to because there are EU rules. But if France decides to do so, which is in fact what Mitterrand had tried to do earlier. In that case, you would have a collapse of the franc on the foreign exchange market, and therefore it would be pulled back because there would be finance flowing out of France, which is exactly what had happened when Mitterrand tried a Keynesian way of reflating the French economy to increase employment when he first became president. Now, and that was, if you like, the first historical instance of globalization of finance coming in the way of the independent autonomy of the nation state to enlarge its demand, to enlarge employment. First historical instance. But anyway, if the US does it, of course, the US is in a much stronger position. There are two problems to it. One problem, which is very important, is that the US still is a nation state. In other words, if the US does it, in that case, a larger fiscal deficit in the US would generate larger demand in the world, but it would generate larger employment outside of the US. It will generate larger employment in other countries, and therefore the US would be importing those goods from them. Therefore, the US debt would go up. So you'll have a situation where the US would be getting indebted in order to generate employment elsewhere. In the old days, you could have said in order to generate employment in China, but the US has now become protectionist vis-a-vis China. Nonetheless, it will generate employment elsewhere. Now, that is something which is not really acceptable to the US as a nation state. So the compulsions of being a nation state come in the way of the US acting as a world state. And so that is point number one. Point number two, of course, is that even in the case of the US, there are limits to what it can do against the wishes of globalized finance. The general point I'm making earlier is not altogether irrelevant, even as far as the US is concerned.
Great, thank you. Let's pivot to your work on fascism. So you clearly demarcate fascism of the interwar period from the neo-fascism of the contemporary era. What are the fundamental differences between the two? Regarding interwar fascism, some have claimed that it needs to be understood, at least in part, as a capitalist reaction formation to a new threat on the world stage, actually existing socialism, which of course definitively appeared in 1917. Do you agree with this characterization of interwar fascism? And finally, given the destruction of so many socialist countries in the neoliberal era, how would you situate neo-fascism in relationship to contemporary socialism?
Well, while fascism, classical fascism of the 1930s, obviously arose in the context of a very serious socialist challenge, I would not say that fascism was only because of the existing socialist countries. In fact, I believe fascism arises in a period of crisis of capitalism. Fascist elements or neo-fascist elements are there in any modern society, but usually as fringe elements. Fascism arises as a serious force only when these fringe elements are really picked up by monopoly capital, and you have an alliance between monopoly capital on the one hand, and of course, the fascist elements on the other hand. And monopoly capital picks them up precisely when there is an existential crisis that it faces because of the crisis of capitalism. Now, obviously, any existential crisis of capitalism is ipso facto a, a socialist threat. But on the other hand, sometimes because of this, people argue that what we witness today is not neo-fascism because there is a socialist threat. Now, I don't agree with that. In other words, a socialist threat does not really arise only when there are socialist countries. A socialist threat arises, it can arise from any source because of the working class, because of the peasantry in societies like ours, for instance, because of peasant uprisings and so on. You can have a threat that is potentially socialist, but any threat to the hegemony of monopoly capital is something which is sought to be warded off by monopoly capital by having an alliance with the neo-fascists or the fascist elements. Classical fascism arose that way. And this alliance serves a number of purposes. First, of course, it changes the discourse. It changes the discourse into hating the Jews or hating the Muslims and things of that kind. In other words, it creates hatred against a particular minority element, particular minority religious group or racial group, ethnic group, and so on. So it changes the discourse, a change in discourse that ipso facto divides the working class and therefore diffuses the possible challenge to the hegemony of monopoly capital. The second thing it does, of course, is lets loose repression. Fascism lets loose repression not just by the state, and that's where there's a big difference between mere authoritarianism and fascism. It lets loose repression by the state, which is combined with repression by fascist thugs on the streets. In every country you have fascists. When fascism is in the ascendancy, fascist thugs let loose on the street, and they are a source of terrorizing civil society. The third way in which fascism classically in the 1930s overcame unemployment and the existential crisis of capitalism is by enlarging employment. In fact, Mikhail Kaletsky, I was talking about a bit earlier, says that the function of 1930s fascism was to make capitalism reconcile itself with full employment. Normally, we know capitalism does not accept full employment because you need a reserve army of labor in order to have work discipline, in order to have real wages being controlled, and so on and so forth. But fascism substitutes political coercion for all that. In other words, you don't need a reserve army of labor because that is indirect coercion. Fascism substitutes direct political coercion for that kind of indirect coercion, which is why it can, and the other fear that, look, if the state through its spending is going to increase employment, in that case, that itself is something which monopoly capital or finance does not like, but that is overcome by the state itself being completely hegemonized by this relationship of monopoly capital with the fascist elements. In other words, it's not a state. There is no next government under fascism, as Kaletsky said, that you can't have tomorrow a labor government coming in and so on and so forth, because under fascism there's no next government. And the third possible objection to full employment that capitalism could have is that where does the state spend? If the state spends in hospitals, then of course it eats away the market for private healthcare. If the state spends in education, it eats away from the market of private education, and so on and so forth. That wherever the state spends, it actually encroaches on the domain of the private sector, of the capitalists. But of course, if the state spends on armaments, then that's a separate thing. That actually creates demand for the private sector. And of course, arming countries is something which eventually leads to war. And that's why Kaletsky said that in the 1930s, fascism played the role. I'm not saying consciously or anything, but it did play the role of making capitalism reconcile itself with full employment. And that it did because it enlarged military expenditures, and it did so by state borrowing. You had national finance capital. You didn't have globalized finance capital. The national finance capital is something that really was very closely linked to with the fascist groups, and therefore they could work out an arrangement where the opposition of finance to larger employment, to full employment, was overcome. Exactly the same is true in Japan, where you actually had full employment, which was reached by the military fascist government. And of course, the question of workers in quotes getting out of hand did not arise because Japanese fascism really killed off large numbers of trade unionists. So fascism's role was that. But on the other hand, when you look at contemporary, by the way, the idea of an alternative way of stimulating activity in the capitalist countries, stimulating employment and so on, is something which had already been provided by Keynes, and something which came into fruition under the New Deal, because the New Deal was and another way of enlarging employment. But as you know, when the New Deal happened, initially there was an increase in employment, but precisely making use of the fact there's an increase in employment, the opposition of American big business to the New Deal meant that very soon Roosevelt had to pull back. And therefore, in 1937, there was another recession in the United States because the New Deal, to some extent, was rolled back. And therefore, the US, and in fact, the rest of the liberal capitalist world, got out of the Great Depression only because of the war, only when they started preparing for the war. In the post-war period, of course, there had been a major shift in the balance of powers inside capitalism. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who had led during the war, lost the election. The Labour Party came to power in Britain. Similarly, all over Europe, social democracy, in France, in France and Italy, the communists were very powerful. So that altogether, you actually had a situation in which there was a tremendous accretion to working class strength in the post-Second World War period. And of course, there had been a very significant expansion of the socialist country, the socialist bloc, because of the Red Armies marching into Eastern European countries, because of which capitalism was forced to make concessions. And what we call the welfare state, I believe, is not a normal functioning of capitalism. It was a concession which was made under very specific circumstances of the post-war period. But of course, what we are seeing now is a gradual dismantling of that arrangement.
Great, thanks. And I'll flag another kind of question that might come up in the larger Q&A session, and that is the relationship between contemporary fascism or neo-fascism and the meteoric rise of China, which of course could lead to a larger debate, but is at least a self-declared socialist country. But in the interest, again, of just moving on to the next question that I shared with you, so you described neo-fascism as an ideological prop for responding to the impasse of neoliberalism, which we were just discussing. Since it promises growth, neoliberalism that is, but cannot deliver, it engages then in various stratagems to create false impressions of growth, beat back opposition, scapegoat others for stagnation, etc. However, contemporary fascism is ultimately incapable of surmounting the impasse of neoliberal capitalism, you argue, because it lacks the ability to overcome the opposition of international finance capital to fiscal activism on the part of the government to generate larger demand, output, and employment. These would require larger government spending, financed either through taxes on capitalists or through a fiscal deficit, both of which finance capital rejects, which is the thesis that you were just discussing a moment ago. So finance capital thereby keeps neo-fascism in check. And you therefore predict that what we are likely to see is, quote, a lingering fascism of less murderous intensity, end quote, than during the interwar period. Some might find this assessment overly sanguine, pointing either to the barbarous intensification of fascism in places like Ukraine and Israel as examples, or to fascistic leaders like Narendra Modi, who was just reelected, of course, and Donald Trump. How would you situate these instances in relationship to your overall thesis?
Well, I was not being sanguine in the sense that I said less murderous intensity. I mean, I think the fact that, let's say in Japan, large numbers of trade unionists were actually just killed, or in Germany, you actually had concentration death camps, and you had communists and so on, or socialists and trade unionists being killed. That kind of intensified application of coercion and violence is something which we are not seeing today. We are not seeing that kind of a situation. But what we are seeing, and I'm afraid this is where my non-sanguineness would show itself, is the fact that you would have a lingering fascism. Okay, so as I was saying, that while classical fascism overcame the economic crisis of capitalism, Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression, and Germany came out in 1933 after Hitler came to power. Today's as long as neoliberalism persists, whether it is the neo-fascists or whether it is the liberal political formations, they would not be able to overcome the crisis, which is why the neo-fascism of today would actually linger on, because, because it's not as if the liberal political formations are any better placed than the neo-fascists to overcome the crisis.
Okay, great. I'll go on to
put differently, I actually believe that that since the neo-fascism we are seeing is, as it were, the culmination of the neoliberal trajectory that capitalism has taken, unless that trajectory is overcome, we would not be able to go beyond neo-fascism either.
Okay. Well, I just have one final question. If people want to start raising hands or typing questions in the chat, feel free, because we'll open up in a moment. You end the book that you co-authored with Utsa Patnaik, Capital and Imperialism, saying that the current period is a propitious one for the socialist project, because not only is capitalism at an impasse from which it does not appear as yet to find a way out, but also because, caught in this impasse, it is conjuring up the forces of fascism everywhere. Why exactly do you consider our moment to be propitious for socialism? Do you see signs that socialism is on the advance? What can be done in order to facilitate this advance?
Well, you see, the reason we argue that is because neoliberal capitalism is, as it were, the latest phase of capitalism. If we are going to overcome neo-fascism, and if we're going to preserve democracy, in that case, we have to go beyond neoliberal capitalism. And doing so would require, since this is the latest phase of capitalism, would require going beyond capitalism. Because in order to fight against neoliberal capitalism, which is basically expressive of the hegemony of globalized finance, of international finance capital, you have to throw off that hegemony. And that being the case, you have to move towards a society beyond capitalism. It's a bit like the argument which Lenin had made that that if monopoly is the last stage of capitalism, going beyond monopoly capitalism doesn't mean going back to competitive capitalism or free competition, but really to go to a new mode of production. And I believe really today, precisely it follows from our argument that that capitalism is at an impasse, and that neoliberal capitalism has to be overcome in order to preserve democracy, not just increase employment and so on, but even to preserve democracy. In that case, it follows that this can be done only through going beyond this stage, which is the last in which is the latest in capitalism, and therefore moving towards an alternative mode of production. As I said, however, I see the socialist project as a freedom project. And it follows, therefore, that the preservation of freedom requires going beyond capitalism. You see, one of the features of contemporary capitalism, you mentioned Ukraine and Israel. One of the features of contemporary capitalism is that it is not only the neo-fascists, but even the liberal political formations are really aiding and abetting, in specific instances, genocide, settler colonialism, and so on. In other words, the threat of a war is something that comes not only from, or not even primarily from the neo-fascist elements, it comes also from the liberal political formations. And that being the case, I believe, of course, that the socialist project must actually make the striving for peace in today's world absolutely central to its political agenda, and of course, together with it, the defense of democracy, the defense of the welfare state, and so on. It's only that way. And obviously, it would not be a socialism like the 1917 revolution had introduced. It will be a socialism of a new kind altogether.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We can open up for general questions, so feel free to use the raise hand function. I might start things off by sharing, I saw at least one or two questions in the chat. And Professor Patnaik, if it's okay with you, we might group 2 or 3 of the questions together in case there's a number of them.
Fine.
Rajinder Singh wrote, my question is about the Worker-Peasant Alliance, which is a crucial bond for transforming society. However, in recent years, the contradictions between them have intensified. How can they come closer together, and what are some ways to strengthen their alliance?
Okay, you see, basically, the entire trajectory of capitalist development is to destroy the peasantry. In other words, primitive accumulation takes the form of, if not destroy the peasantry, to actually make the peasantry subordinate to capital, agribusiness. In other words, the peasantry then becomes subordinated to capital. Now, this is a process which particularly now, one of the differences between, I mentioned independent India after, immediately after independence and so on. One of the things that the dirigist or statist phase of development in countries like India did was to protect the peasantry against the encroachments of capital. While neoliberalism exposes the peasantry to encroachments of capital. Modi, you may have seen, brought in 3 new, farm laws on farming, against which the peasants went on a year's agitation. So Modi was forced to withdraw it. In fact, many people have been arguing that Modi's recent defeat has much to do with the peasant anger against his earlier regime. So that, peasantry is an extremely potent revolutionary force in societies, particularly underdeveloped societies like India and so on. You see, as far as Europe is concerned, they virtually exported their unemployed to the New World. So the peasantry was squeezed. The peasantry lost partly its jobs, and partly the peasantry, under the pressure of the squeeze, migrated to the New World. As a result, the anger of the peasantry was not really exhibited against capitalism the way that it gets exhibited in societies of the third world, of societies like India. And that is, by the way, one of the reasons why capitalism is much more patently incompatible with democracy in societies like India than it is in Europe, because in Europe, the safety valve of vast 50 million Europeans migrated to the New World. Therefore, you really did not have that kind of enormous mass of reserve army which was hanging around in Europe. On the contrary, because they could migrate, it raised the reservation wage of European workers and so on, because of which there was a general improvement in the standards of living that created the conditions for democracy to thrive. But on the other hand, in societies like India, if capitalism is really dominant, I mean, and I think the Modi episode illustrates it, in that case, it can be dominant only by throttling democracy, because otherwise the peasants and so on are really going to agitate against the tendencies of capitalism to make them subservient. And that being the case, a very important plank in societies, certainly like India, for the socialist project, a very important instrument is the Worker-Peasant Alliance. I mean, I think it was greatness of Lenin that he actually saw it, but the Worker-Peasant Alliance, Marx himself was much more ambiguous about the role of the peasantry. Engels was more sympathetic, but Lenin certainly brought it center stage. And I think in today's world, it is absolutely crucial, certainly in third world societies.
Great. I think there's at least two more questions in the chat that I'll share with you. And if I missed anything in the chat, feel free to bump them. So Francesca said, I'm thinking about certain historical reference points that helped engender the conceptual space for the advent of interwar fascism. The Verdun myth in Germany, the loss of Fiume from the Italian state after the Treaty of Versailles, etc. Is it reductive to search for loose analogs in our present moment? Regardless of this, how do the conditions of neoliberalism shift the import and impact of such intersubjective historical discourses, especially with regard to the nation state? So that's one question from Francesca. Scott added that they're wondering if in the article that you just published or recently published, Why Neoliberalism Needs Neofascists, you propose a solution, quote, a robust welfare state with revived public social services, public goods, and high employment. This sounds great, but also potentially reformist and not necessarily revolutionary. Instead of trying to work within the system and implementing a wealth tax, for instance, shouldn't we be mobilizing the working class and organizing strong cadre development so we are ready for revolution when the moment arises?
Can I just take the second question first?
Yes.
You see, revolution arises when the system is incapable of yielding to reforms. In other words, I don't draw a distinction between reform and revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution happened on the slogan of land, peace, and bread. The point is that precisely because I believe capitalism today is withdrawing from the welfare state, demanding a welfare state is one way of demanding a reform that the system cannot give, which is why then it becomes possible for us to move towards a revolution. So I don't draw this distinction between reform and revolution. I really talk about what the system is capable of giving, and I believe contemporary capitalism is not capable of giving a welfare state. The fact that it did so in the post-war period, as I mentioned, was because of very specific historical circumstances when it really needed to survive politically against the kind of, both working class upsurge in the metropolis and, of course, the emergence of socialism over large parts of the world. But today it is not in a position to even give welfare state, and we have discussed all that. So I don't draw this distinction, and I believe it's very important to demand reforms and demand such reforms that actually the system we know is not capable of giving. And that is also how people, if you just tell people, let's have a revolution, nobody would come with you. The point is that the demand for a revolution, or if you like, the movement towards a revolution has to be through concrete steps. And these concrete steps are steps of demanding reforms. As far as the first question is concerned, yes, I think, into the 1930s conjuncture, a number of factors entered, and you're certainly right, Treaty of Versailles. I mean, Keynes wrote Economic Consequences of the Peace, which actually Lenin used in the Second Congress of the Communist International in order to really make the point that capitalism had come to an end, that I mean, it had really run out of, it was a very deep crisis, that it was a period of inter-imperialist rivalry, and that period of inter-imperialist rivalry had given rise to wars, and of course after the war it had given rise to such a distorted balance where Germany was really marginalized. Large numbers of people felt that marginalization is going to create militarism in Germany. In fact, Keynes himself felt that, and it did create militarism in Germany. It did strengthen the whole fascist tendency and so on. So all those are important elements in the creation of the situation that we found in the 1930s, a situation that really German fascism took advantage of. Power. I mean, I think whatever they consider to be the Chinese area, they would be absolutely kind of, 200% committed to retrieving that. But on the other hand, China, as an imperialist power in the world as a whole, is something which I don't subscribe to, and I don't see any theoretical reason for the Chinese economy to be imperialist the way I see capitalist economies to be imperialist. In fact, throughout its history, China actually has been, there was a Chinese ship that actually went around, and they were in a position to really become expansionist. But on the other hand, such was the feeling inside China that fairly soon China was struck by a calamity, and they actually thought that that calamity arose because they had gone out, and because of that, any possible imperial projects that China could have had was completely destroyed, and the Chinese Navy never really made such a kind of, ambulation of the world as a whole as it had done at that time. So the point is, the Chinese have always been not a country which has particularly gone out to kind of, hegemonize other countries. One of the reasons, perhaps, that both Japan and Britain and so on went around hegemonizing other countries was their shortage of raw materials. Now, I think, as the Chinese emperor said, that we have everything. We don't need anything from anywhere outside. In fact, the same would be true probably of a country like India, because, other than oil, India can produce almost everything. So that, these are countries which are rich in their resource endowments and so on. And so I would not call today's world, I mean, the conflict between the US and China and so on as inter-imperialist rivalries. Now, that being the case, there is obviously a very big difference between the 1930s situation and the contemporary situation. If anything, international finance capital would actually like to prevent inter-imperialist rivalries within the imperialist countries from becoming intractable. In other words, it would like to control the, 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 the potential conflicts between the imperialist countries, and this is something which actually is a force for keeping them together as opposed to fighting amongst themselves.
Great. There are a few more questions in the chat. I might just pick up with the theme of China, because we lost a little bit of what you said at the beginning due to the video. But how overall do you situate the kind of meteoric rise of China on the world stage in relationship to the central thesis that you have on neoliberalism and neo-fascism, and that we've been discussing? So I'll leave that as a kind of very general question that you can approach from the angle that you see fit, but I'll also snuggle in or sneak in a second question if I can. Srayashi wrote, the classical fascism was defeated by a strong wave of socialist uprisings across the globe, yet in neo-fascism, the global tendency is to move toward democratic alliance and form worldwide social democratic movements towards the creation of a multipolar world. How capable is this wave of in defeating neo-fascism?
No, I think neo-fascism, as I was trying to say earlier, the period of neo-fascism is also characterized by a period of bankruptcy of the liberal political formations. If you look at the Social Democrats of Germany, I mean, the Social Democrats of Germany are really, they have no solution either to the Ukraine crisis or to Israel. If anything, they are simply following the Americans. So, and this is not only true of Social Democrats, this is even true of large numbers of sympathizers of the left as well. In other words, even Die Linke, as it existed earlier, would really like to be part of some kind of a coalition government, and therefore Die Linke more or less mimics whatever the Social Democrats and others are saying. So you have, in fact, you have in this sense a situation similar to what happened at the time of the First World War, when Lenin and Luxemburg and so on, the kind of broke away from social democracy. I mean, the German social democracy was such a powerful force. It had 86 daily newspapers in Germany, but the German social democracy completely went along with the war effort. I mean, which is where you just had Karl Liebknecht and others walking out, voting against the war credits, etc. So it's a bit like that, that at this moment, it is not as if the identifiable social democrats or the identifiable left that also can be relied upon to fight for peace or to fight for a welfare state. But on the other hand, new forces come up. Within the working class, new forces come up among the students and so on. In Europe, new forces come up with the peasantry in India, where you actually can have the beginnings of a new movement altogether. In other words, I don't have much faith in the existing left movements as they exist. But on the other hand, I do believe there's a great future for the left.
Wonderful. And on the question of China and how it is situated.
Okay, you see, China has obviously benefited from the international movement of capital. But at the same time, obviously, this whole idea of relocation of activities from the metropolis to China and to other third world countries is something that China has benefited greatly from. It has benefited precisely because of the fact that it actually has a very disciplined and trained workforce and so on, and a political environment that is, from the point of view of international capital, in quotes, a fairly stable one and so on. But at the same time, it's very important to realize that China has not become hegemonized by globalized finance. Because in China, suppose you wish to have a financial outflow, in that case, if an American financier wishes to take money out of China, then the American financier would be required to sell it to some other foreign financier, not to a Chinese, not to a Chinese party. In other words, you have a situation where you cannot have the kind of massive capital flights that you can have from other third world countries, including from India, potentially. And that is something which really implies that China controls globalized finance. It's not beholden to globalized finance. It can actually pursue policies of its own. Now, to some extent, because of the slowing down of the Chinese growth rate in the recent period, there has been an effort to develop the domestic market and to use the domestic market as a means of sustaining its growth rate, which I think is a good thing, because enlarging the domestic market necessarily means improving the condition of the peasantry, necessarily means improving the condition of the working class, increasing welfare expenditures domestically. I believe that is a welcome change which has been forced on China because of the global capitalist crisis and American protectionism and all this. But on the whole, I do believe that this entire emphasis which you find on the growth rate, on production, I call it productionism. The entire emphasis on productionism rather than freedom is something which to my mind is really not in keeping with my socialist convictions.
Great. I'll ask the question in the chat that was shared by Tristan, and then Joao has his hand up. So if the housing crisis of excessive costs, well, I guess the question is, does the housing crisis with its excessive costs for those who are seeking housing figure into your analysis of the problems of demand and employment, since it forces workers to burn an even larger portion of their wage on subsistence, right? So basically, how does this, the excessive cost of housing relate to your kind of overall thesis concerning demand and employment? I don't know if you want to respond briefly to that, and then I'll turn it over to Joao.
Well, I mean, the only thing I would like to say is that, the collapse of the housing bubble, of course, was the immediate in the US was the immediate provocation for the crisis that happened. That basically the tendency towards overproduction in world capitalism, which was arising because of the enormous increase in income inequalities that have occurred within countries and taking the world as a whole, would have given rise to overproduction, but that was kept in check first by the dot-com bubble in the United States and subsequently by the housing bubble. Now, of course, the point is that, when you have the collapse of the housing bubble, there is no corresponding bubble that has taken place. And as a result, world capitalism has run into, and of course, bubbles in individual small countries would not really make that much of a difference. In the US, there has not been any significant corresponding bubble which can actually sustain world capitalism, which is why we are in a crisis. Now but beyond that, I would not really like to say anything about the housing costs and so on, because I really
Okay. Okay, we lost you just a tiny bit at the end, but Joao, why don't you weigh in with your question, and then if there's something else that you'd like to add to sum up what you said at the end, feel free. Joao?
Okay, thank you very much for your talk and for work. I really like the notion capitalism and impasse, and I can fully agree with that. I think we all can take a lot of different elements home and reflect. They're really important. Also, I fully agree with the notion that the welfare state was a sort of intermezzo due to particular historical conditions, especially posed by socialist communist movements. However, my question, my critique would be in regard to the juxtaposition between what you call the fascism from 1930s and neo-fascism. It seems to me rather rigid juxtaposition, since through fascistic relations, they're always embedded in specific conditions, and throughout there is usually, the notion Italian, German fascism, but we know that after the Second World War, in which the West claimed itself being democratic, we had in the core of Europe, in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, fascism throughout. Then, while this was happening already, U.S. through the agency and other mechanisms, they instated dictatorship in '64 in Brazil. They overcame the communist power in Indonesia, killing over 1 million people, instating also brutal dictatorship over there, and then in Latin America, in Chile, in Argentina, and so on. So many cases. We also know that after the Second World War, through Gladio operation, through paperclip, and etc., fascists from Europe, they're incorporated in the capitalist core and used for different means. And you said that neo-fascism seems like homeopathic violence, a violence not just latent or slow, not really potent, not being unleashed in just a position to fascism before. But if you look the history of fascism, I think they were always hand in glove with liberalism, and not just like in page 306 from the text, you claim neoliberalism thus creates conditions propitious for fascism. Hitler was already in 1939 voted by Time magazine the Man of the Year, and he had already invaded Czechoslovakia, and Mein Kampf was written with the whole plan laid bare to everybody to see. So that was already within liberal conditions, and all the other examples I gave were also within liberal framework, within Keynesian framework, within all different frameworks that are not just the neoliberalism. I understand that neoliberalism, it creates such a condition of precarity that violence becomes the more important, the censorship and different elements to control become all the more important. But yeah, like I was saying, that my counter thesis is that I think I see fascism as a tactic within the capitalist apparatus that always is placed in an art for interplay with other modes of governance or technology of power within capitalist relations. So the notion, just because it hasn't taken the state, what does that mean? Because it's also embedded in US American state, and other states have been embedded. So I don't know. I think there's a real strong clear cut, whereas in reality everything is much more fluid, and I think it's really hard to say fascism from 1930s and neo-fascism now through due to neoliberalism. So yeah, that was my point.
Yes, there is a view that fascism is not some. I mean, it's a part of capitalism. There is no doubt that actually, Hitler derived the idea of these concentration camps and so on from European imperialist experience. So that, imperialism, fascism, they're all very closely linked. But nonetheless, I would like to draw a distinction between fascism and liberal capitalism. I mean, I think it's a useful distinction. Certainly, it's a distinction which, let us say, in India, makes an enormous difference. I mean, there is just no question. What we have had in the last 10 years is miles different from anything which we had earlier, except the period of the emergency in mid-70s. So the fact is that fascism does make a difference to democratic institutions and so on. Now, and it has made a difference to democratic institutions. So even though there is a fascistic trait, the imperialist project, that imperialism and fascism are very closely intermingled, nonetheless, I would like to say that, and in any case, contemporary imperialism does not really entail occupation in that sense. Contemporary imperialism takes the form of operating through the economic mechanisms, by and large, as far as the world is concerned. But I would like to say that nonetheless, fascism is a very real thing, and it does mean abrogation of democracy. Now, that is something which arises only in a very specific context. Now, you mentioned, let us say, Keynesian liberalism. You see, Keynes was a liberal anti-communist. In fact, he was terrified of the revolution. His argument precisely was that, look, capitalism, if you leave it as it is going to lead to a revolution. Therefore, you must do something to make sure that the kind of unemployment which is being generated by capitalism is something which is kept in check. Therefore, the whole idea behind the liberal interventions in capitalism through the interventions by the state was really to thwart any revolutionary prospects. Now, fascism was one kind of intervention, but on the other hand, There was scope, as I said, at that time. New Deal was an example, but though it was not sustained, but New Deal was an example. And of course, what you had in the post-Second World War period was a generalization of the New Deal kind of intervention. The historical conjuncture permitted that. So it is possible to have a liberal intervention under in capitalism as opposed to a fascist intervention. What I'm saying is that in today's world, neither a liberal intervention nor a fascist intervention is possible, because any such intervention is by the government of a nation state, which is confronting finance that is globalized. And as a result, the incapacity of the nation state to intervene does not disappear if the nation state is fascist. So since any kind of intervention of this sort is not possible, therefore you have fascism or neo-fascism playing the role of changing the discourse, using repression, using coercion against democratic movements and so on. It's playing a negative role. It cannot even have the kind of positive role that classical fascism had until 1939. As a matter of fact, there was a period in Germany in the 1930s when the horrors of the war had not yet become visible, but on the other hand, employment had increased, because of which actually the fascists had actually become quite popular. Exactly like that in Japan, when you had the situation where unemployment had been overcome, but on the other hand, Japan had entered the war earlier, but on the other hand, it was not so disastrous as far as the Japanese people were concerned, so horrendous, and therefore there was a period in which the Japanese were reconciled to the government that was happening. So the point is that that kind of positive, temporary, transient, positive role of fascism that you had in the 1930s is something which you do not have today, because intervention by fascism is something which is not possible. War is not possible because, as I said, war among the imperialist countries is not possible because, as I said, international finance would not like it. It does not want a world partitioned into spheres of influence. Therefore, it would not like that kind of armaments build up and so on. And in any case, armaments build up would not add to aggregate demand for reasons I mentioned, if it is not financed either by fiscal deficit or by taxing the rich, both of which are really opposed by finance capital. So I think the fact of international finance capital being the driving force behind neoliberalism is something which basically implies that neither a liberal political solution nor a neo-fascist political solution to the current impasse of capitalism is possible. By the way, a liberal political solution has been talked about by, for instance, the Economist of London. They are actually talking in terms of a Keynes-Roosevelt moment. Today, at this moment, they say that capitalism has its Keynes-Roosevelt moment, that we should revive the Keynes-Roosevelt strategy in order to get capitalism out of this impasse. But on the other hand, this is something which does not appear to be on the cards for reasons I've been discussing.
Great. I think we have just two final questions, and then we can wrap up. One of them overlaps with something you just mentioned. Markella was curious to hear your thoughts on how the global arms trade relates to neoliberalism and neo-fascism. Is the military-industrial complex the engine of neo-fascism? Is one question. The other, I also see there's a new hand up though. Why exactly can't capitalism under neoliberalism deliver state welfare? So this is asking you to return to some of your earlier discussion on this. Wouldn't this be dependent on the character and demands of movements on the ground? Now, but also then, for example, in the 1930s in the US, and the labor struggles demands for a second New Deal, which has ultimately produced the American welfare state, however anemic, after 1935. Or is there something structural about capitalism at this moment connected to finance capital's resistance to broader employment that prevents such a reform? My sense is that times have changed, and our distance from the Russian Revolution makes the demand for a welfare state not a necessarily popular one now.
You know, the point I'm trying to make is that the introduction or the strengthening of the welfare state, the prevention of its dismantling, or the introduction in many instances of welfare state measures is something which neoliberal capitalism can no longer do, but it is something which should be the kind of transitional demand that leads on to socialism. In other words, it is something which is part of a transitional demand that we can make in order to embark on a socialist trajectory. The socialists should be making this demand. The socialists should be making this demand precisely because capitalism cannot really accede to this demand. Why can't it accede? It can't accede because the whole point of neoliberalism is to have relative freedom of movement of commodities and capital, including finance, across country borders. Now, in order to do that, you would have to have, I mean, as a complementary measure, control on the magnitude of the fiscal deficit. Okay, because suppose tomorrow the government enlarged the welfare state, and suppose tomorrow the government enlarged welfare state by, let's say, raising the corporate tax rate. Now, immediately you would have a flight of capital out of the country. Now, in order to prevent the flight of capital out of the country, you'd have to have capital controls. The moment you have capital controls, you're no longer in a neoliberal world. So neoliberalism would require control on capital flows. And of course, if you have control on capital flows, you'll have to have control on trade flows. And therefore, you are no longer in a neoliberal world. Autonomy of the nation state presupposes control on capital and trade flows. If you have freedom of trade and capital flows, in that case, that undermines the autonomy of the nation state. That's the basic argument which I'm trying to make. And the freedom of trade and capital flows is being forced on countries because of the hegemony, because the domination of international finance capital. So international finance capital forces countries to get into this neoliberal frame, to get into neoliberal strategy. And when you do that, then the capacity of the state to actually intervene for increasing welfare expenditures and so on goes down. Of course, that is at the economic level. We know that any country which would actually put trade and capital controls would be a country against which all the advanced capitalist countries would then impose sanctions and so on, saying that it is a deviant state, the rogue state, and so on. And these sanctions would be followed by the other advanced capitalist countries, creating big problems as far as this particular deviant is concerned. But even leaving aside sanctions, the point is that, that it would get into such enormous transitional problems that to require you see the transitional problems that would arise if the state wishes to recapture its autonomy vis-a-vis globalized finance or globalized capital would require substantial class support domestically, for which the worker-peasant alliance is important. And of course, it would require political maturity on the part of the workers, political maturity on the part of the peasants who would be prepared to undergo even a period of transition of difficulties, economic material difficulties. Suppose you have sanctions, then of course you would have a period of difficulties. If you have, for instance, trade control, then there are some goods you wouldn't be able to import. Now, even for a country like India, which can produce most of the goods that it in case of controlling imports, it would require some time. It would require a year, 2 years, 3 years before you can actually produce those goods. So there has to be a period of difficulty. So you would require a substantial class support of workers and peasants. And it is that which makes sure that the transition would have to go beyond capitalism. Worker-peasant alliance is not going to be formed in order to have a liberal capitalism as opposed to neoliberal capitalism, or a Keynesian capitalism as opposed to neoliberal capitalism. If you have a worker-peasant alliance, that must have an agenda that goes beyond capitalism.
Great. I'll flag, there was the question about the kind of international arms dealing, but I'll turn it over to Catherine in any case for what will be, I believe, our last question. So Catherine, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to pinpoint some important definition, which might be if we don't consider this difference in definitions of the.
Catherine, can you speak a bit louder, please?
Yeah.
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 Maybe speak directly. Yeah, directly into the microphone. There's a bit of an echo.
Yeah. So I think it's important to pinpoint some difference in definitions of understanding of nation state. The difference between nation state as a member of United Nations and nation state as a unique system of how a nation and the state become congruent inside every specific country. And just by the nature of historical process, nation states sometimes even not formed inside the countries which, like by international law, are considered nation states. Why it's important? Because a nation state, it has a full monopoly on violence, full monopoly on certain laws, and the states which where nation state fractured or failed, the government does not have the same resources, and that means as a result, the interventions both of neoliberalism and fascist process, these interventions they work differently. So we can hardly say that there is some general neofascism of today, but it's rather depends very much on the stage on which the nation state exists in the certain country. So, for example, if the country is, let's say, Saudi Arabia, formally it's nation state, but by de facto it's a tribal society. So everything what's going on inside it, it's traditional tribal processes. Or when nation states have some weaknesses inside the concept of the nation, inside between the people, the social contract between people and the state, neoliberals, imperialists can exploit it, and we can see results like what happened to Yugoslavia. So I think it's important not to generalize our observations from what is closer to us into the rest, into other countries, and it's important to consider some unique aspects which are going on in the country. And it's also important because sometimes modern fascism in many countries actually it exploits the need of the population to form the nation state. I mean, the need of national liberation struggle, and they sometimes masquerade under this national liberation struggle. So, I think it's important why we do not mix all together in one into one general perception.
No, I defend the nation state because the nation state is precisely the area over which the people exercise their franchise. Okay, now many people, just imagine, in India we have had an election. People vote among alternative political formations with alternative economic agendas. Forget about neo-fascism. In a neoliberal economy, all political formations have the same agenda. Namely, you have relatively free trade, you have capital flows, and how to make your country attractive for international capital. So the differences in the programs of the different political formations relate to who gives more concessions, who gives kind of quicker clearance to foreign projects, and so on and so on. In other words, if therefore the people are not given a choice between alternative agendas, a whole lot of economic agendas are simply out of the question the moment we are talking in terms of a neoliberal regime, and a neoliberal regime basically is a globalized regime. Okay. Now, many people there who criticize the nation state do not, to my mind, see the fact that neoliberalism is a betrayal of people's franchise. I mean, you think of let's say Syriza. Syriza came to power promising that it is going to do something altogether different from what had been going on before. So Syriza came to power on the basis of an alternative agenda. People voted for Syriza because of that alternative agenda. But the moment Greece remained within the vortex of financial flows, Syriza, like any other formation, pursued exactly the same kinds of policies that the previous governments were doing. And therefore, that was a betrayal of the mandate of the people. And therefore, when I say autonomy of the nation state, I defend the autonomy of the nation state because, to my mind, there is, as it were, a contradiction between the sovereignty of international capital and the sovereignty of the people. If I believe in popular sovereignty, then since popular sovereignty is exercised only at the level of the nation state, I must believe in a revival of the autonomy of the nation state. If I subvert that autonomy, then that is a way of ensuring that the sovereignty of the people is replaced by sovereignty of international capital.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I know that there might be some other follow-up questions and things like this, but I think this is a good point to wrap up. I also know that it's late in India, so thank you once again for joining. We're all applauding, at least virtually, even if you can't hear us. Thank you for the excellent questions, and wishing everyone a wonderful evening or afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. So take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye now. Bye.